Well, once again, welcome everyone to what should be a very stimulating discussion. It's a very full agenda, a remarkably talented and experienced roster of speakers and discussants with us today. And some background documentation has been circulated in advance, beginning with the paper circulated by Brazil a year prior in 2022, and then two papers co-sponsored by two of our speakers, among others, Thailand and Australia, on small reform steps to make a difference and maximizing the value of WTO ministerial conferences. Many of you have direct experience in the ministerial process over many many incarnations and many locations around the world. And of course, the record has been, shall we say, very mixed between deadlock and failure and incremental and monumental success along the way. So I'm not sure we're going to see any consistent pattern, but other than, I think, a shared desire among many to make the best and to promote the best of the highest decision-making body of the WTO, which is the Ministerial Conference. We know that ambassadors resident in Geneva in the form of the General Council have delegated authority to make decisions in between conferences. We know that notionally, according to the WTO corpus of agreements, ministerial meetings are supposed to take place every 2 years, not every year, although that has been a proposal. So both the record of when ministers meet, how they meet, and how the meetings are conducted brings us a rich and varied experience. And my final introductory word is simply to note, for those of you who haven't participated, is like any major conference or convention, over and above the formal meetings, one finds with great frequency breakout sessions, smaller groups, the famous or infamous green room among them, but sometimes interest and issue-based to see if compromises can be had among those that are directly concerned. So it's any ministerial conference presents a fairly complex picture. In between the ambassadors and the ministers are senior capital-based officials, and depending on how governments are organized, the vice ministers, deputy ministers sometimes play a key role. There have been experiments with capital-based meetings in Geneva together with ambassadors as part of the recipe and preparatory process as well. And I think our speakers and discussants will no doubt reflect on the respective roles of officials versus ministers and of capitals versus Geneva-based officials. But because we have such a roster of talented people and our usual limited time, I'm going to jump right into it. We will hear from three people, none of whom need introduction. Ambassador James Baxter from Australia, Ambassador Li Chenggang from China, and Ambassador Pimchanok Pitfield from Thailand to offer their comments and insights as discussants. Afterwards, former minister, if I can say so, Cecilia Malmström, and Peter Ungphakorn, both of whom are loyal and very active members of the Friends of Multilateralism Group, among their other major activities. So ambassadors, plural, I don't have any information regarding a pre-agreed order, but you are listed alphabetically. So if that's not objectionable, may I start then with a dear former colleague and counterpart, James Baxter from Australia, to kick us off. Thank you for doing this. And unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to see you after several years as well, and really commendable that you and so many other friends and former colleagues are doing the work that you're doing. And it's terrific that we're here to discuss what is a very topical issue in the WTO. And I'm certainly very, very proud to be joined by two fellow co-sponsors of our proposal on reforming ministerial conferences. As you said, Jonathan, the Ministerial Conference is the WTO's premier decision-making body. Each conference is an opportunity for senior political level discussion and negotiation across the membership. A ministerial conference can be a forum for resolving differences that officials haven't been able to settle, but also for providing guidance on the future work of the organisation. As we know, however, in practice, conferences have rarely lived up to expectations. Too frequently, they've involved dramatic, last-minute, high-stakes rolls of the dice to land a negotiating package. And the long-held wisdom has been that a pressure cooker environment is essential for concluding a package that has something in it for all members. But in practice, of course, the WTO has only landed two multilateral agreements over 13 ministerial conferences. And since the demise of the Doha round, conferences have generally not focused on what is probably uppermost in trade ministers' minds when they're visiting. Now, as the main occasion when the WTO generates a profile among governments, the media, and the public, ministerial conferences shape views about the organisation. Disappointments at the outcomes of conferences have arguably contributed disproportionately to the growing sense that the WTO is less capable of serving members' interests, or is simply less relevant to governments as they grapple with the challenges they've been facing in recent years. And that's a problem because it risks leading to, and in our view has already led to, a greater sense of disenchantment about the WTO than is warranted. That risks, in turn, an underinvestment by governments in efforts to support their domestic objectives through bolstering rational approaches to trade. And that in an era when it's just not possible for governments of any size to generate growth at the levels they would wish without a robust framework of global trade rules. So it's against that background that Australia worked with other members to develop some ideas about enhancing ministerial conferences. And there are really two broad areas we see as warranting attention. The first is in setting expectations for conferences, and the second is in the delivery. So looking at our proposal specifically, really in light of our experience at MC12 and a view about conferences that we'd been forming over a longer period, Australia, working with some others, developed a proposal aimed at enhancing the role of ministerial conferences in the WTO. Firstly, we wanted to shift the pressure onto Geneva negotiators to close negotiating gaps and to harvest outcomes in the General Council wherever possible, rather than expecting ministers to close wide gaps during a 3 or 4 day conference that officials could not close over a period of 2 years. The idea was that conferences could endorse any concluded negotiations, and ministers could focus their time at ministerial conferences on the live negotiations which required political will to get them over the line. In short, we wanted to reduce the risk of setting unrealistic expectations of ministerial conferences, and also to sharpen expectations about what members should be seeking to achieve intersessionally in Geneva. With less pressure closing on all negotiations, the idea was that ministers would have more time at conferences to deliberate on emerging trade policy challenges. We know ministers are grappling with these challenges at home, and conferences provide an invaluable opportunity for them to compare experiences and discuss possible solutions for those issues. They're the sorts of conversations that are already taking place in other international organisations, including the OECD and APEC. But in our view, it's important that they happen as well at the heart of the multilateral trading system in the WTO, where ministers can talk to really a global set of their counterparts and develop a greater understanding of the challenges at play for members at different levels of development. Our thinking as well was that the discussions that ministers had at conferences could be used to launch new deliberations and rulemaking projects on major trade challenges where appropriate to do so. Their discussions could provide some initial direction to officials to guide the work between conferences. Secondly, given the priority that world leaders and trade ministers place on WTO reform, we thought that conferences could also be used to discuss how the WTO can best serve members' interests. Leveraging the reform mandate we agreed at MC12 and then reaffirmed at MC13 to set the WTO up to be well equipped to tackle current and future trade challenges. And then finally, we saw value in the Director General's calling ad hoc intersessional ministerial gatherings, similar to one that was called in 2021 on fisheries subsidies. Those meetings could help to progress negotiations where political engagement was needed intersessionally, and where possible conclude them, rather than waiting for the next biennial conference. Against that background, we wanted the Abu Dhabi conference to be a reform ministerial, one that significantly shifted how we deliver in the WTO and established a strong and forward-looking agenda for the organisation. So what's our self-assessment? Well, working with our co-sponsors, we did see in the lead up to MC13 a level of interest across the spectrum of members. There was a very pleasing response to some of the ideas in our paper. And we did look at MC13 as a sort of proof of concept for some of those ideas. If you look at what happened, around half of the Abu Dhabi package was concluded in Geneva before the conference began, including a solid set of development outcomes. And negotiations on dispute settlement reform, the e-commerce moratorium, and the rest of the development package together comprised a realistic workload for ministers to get through. And in fact, they achieved outcomes of some value in all of those areas. At the conference, there were also ministerial conversations, as they were called, on major trade challenges facing the WTO, inclusion and sustainable development, which included industrial policies and issues relating to the environment. Now, those sessions were clearly of interest to ministers, with speaking slots oversubscribed. What we'd hope to do in future is facilitate more of a smaller group format that will promote interaction between ministers. So that were the positives. But Abu Dhabi, unfortunately, also showed the limits of ministerial conferences as they currently operate. The high-stake negotiations that we set ourselves up for relating to fisheries subsidies, a work program on agriculture, and the deliberative agenda, much of which was ripe for harvest, did not, in the end, eventuate. Thankfully, in light of that experience, we're seeing a further shift in Geneva in thinking about ministerial conferences. The Director General reported to ambassadors at the May General Council meeting that members overwhelmingly support concluding the unfinished business from MC13 before MC14 in Cameroon. She also said that at that General Council meeting as well, we saw a very frank discussion on the core problem of consensus decision-making at the WTO. The challenge of consensus goes to the heart of WTO reform and does need to be addressed so that ministerial conference reform efforts can be fully effective. We're hoping an upcoming July reform retreat will be the next step for that discussion. Of course, in all of this, we recognise that shifting culture takes time in any institution, and we're trying to do it here among 164 diverse members. But we do remain determined to build on our success to drive further reform in Cameroon. And it's against that background that we're very interested to hear ideas coming out of this discussion from today, from colleagues in Geneva and more broadly. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Very comprehensive. I'm glad it's being recorded, should you choose not to distribute the written version of your remarks. Lots of food for thought in elaborating the paper already circulated. As I said, proceeding alphabetically, let me turn to the Ambassador of China, please. And unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Minister Fried. I would like to thank FMG for this invitation. I was very pleased to join today's discussion. This topic is very pertinent, especially in light of the MC13. The DG has described the MC13 results as the glass half full. We managed to achieve multiple development outcomes, including 2 accessions and decisions on SDT and LDC graduation. Service Domestic Regulation Agreement entered into force. 124 members concluded the investment facilitation for development agreement and requested the incorporation into Annex 4 of the WTO agreement. At the same time, it was deeply regrettable that we failed to deliver some important outcomes within reach, including the Phase 2 negotiations, agriculture negotiation roadmap, as well as some forward-looking paragraphs in the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Declaration. In terms of the process, there were the usual complaints on transparency and on the last-minute drama. To be fair, we had tried our best. What is more frustrating is a block of all other multilateral process with a so-called lose-lose strategy. In terms of IFD, the absence of a dedicated multilateral session to discuss the request of incorporation is deeply concerning. This request is duly put forward by 3/4 of the WTO membership. It is worth recalling that Article 4 of the WTO agreement provides that the MC should have the authority to take decisions on all matters and any of the multilateral trade agreements, if so requested by a member. After MC13, Geneva is in the mood for reflections, as can be seen from the March and the May General Council. A retreat has been planned in early July. One aspect of the reflections is our topic today. That is how the MC could be optimized and better leveraged to improve all functions of the WTO. I want to share my views from the perspectives of process and substance. On process, 3 points to share. The first is that we should make full use of the Geneva process and get work done here. More time and energy should be given to the discussion of the outcome documents and ink as much agreement as possible before the MC. Don't expect the ministers to negotiate line by line. It is a waste of time for the minister and the MC. As MC13 showed, there's a little hope of success. So the reform of the MC should start with the Geneva process, and in particular with the General Council. We saw some improvements of the May GC meeting. Agenda items are organized into 3 categories: for decision, for discussion, and for information, which aims at a better GC with a clearer indication for decision-making and more effective discussions. This is an ongoing process of reform by doing. The second lesson on process is that there needs a better balance between no surprise and drama, between transparency and delivery. Regarding no surprise and drama, the Geneva process should be productive and submit a well-cooked issue to the MC. However, for the most controversial issue that Geneva has exhausted its resources, there has to be the drama of the 11th hour for the ministers to deliver. In order to de-dramatize the MC, to avoid ministers' personal engagement in technical discussions, China made a submission on reform by doing, titled Small Steps to make a difference. Specifically, China suggested to have a SOM, senior official meeting, pre-MC. That is to start the MC from the SOM. Regarding transparency and delivery, transparency is important because it creates trust, especially the WTO practice is decision-making by consensus, and every member can say no. But for an organization with 164 members, going to be 166, it's impossible that every member engage in every topic at the same level due to different interests and priorities. And in order to make breakthrough, the need to focus the discussions among most relevant members. Of course, in this process, all members should be well informed. So transparency doesn't mean every member should be invited to each session, but they should be informed and their voices and concerns should be heard. In this regard, group or regional representatives' role is important. Last but not least, on process, new tools need to be developed to help build consensus and to confront the abuse of consensus. The importance to preserve the consensus practice has been reaffirmed by all members during the May GC. The DG asked a follow-up question, which is very important and touches upon the core of the debate. Consensus for what? It is consensus for delivery. As the Chinese saying goes, if the skin is gone, the fur becomes homeless and non-existent. When WTO no longer can deliver due to abuse of consensus, the vote with the feet will replace the consensus practice. Decision-making on important trade-related issues will leave the WTO to other forms, less multilateral or more prone to power politics, or even worse, that is, unilaterally. The developing members and small economies would stand to lose the most. Therefore, while we must uphold the principle of consensus, we need to explore how to build consensus creatively. Ideas have been flagged on voluntary opt-out, reservation, and other common tools in international treaty making. Of course, the Marcus Agreement stipulates voting procedure as an alternative. Vote has never happened before. It is not because there is no such option. It is because WTO members value the consensus practice and want to preserve it in the interest of all members and of the institution. But it should not be taken for granted. If the consensus principle is systematically abused to block multilateral process, the hostage needs to fight back for its survival. On substance, considering the paramount importance of development issues, and MC14 will be held in Africa, concrete deliverable on development is a must at MC14 to help rebuild trust and confidence among members. In this regard, as a first step, China recently submitted a communication to provide reflections on approaches to development issues. Such reflections are captured by 5 key phrases: new perspectives, not only positions, incremental steps, stronger capacity building, and special and differential treatment. It is proposed to apply these reflections to revitalize the CTD deliberative functions, to build a stronger capacity building elements in existing negotiations, and initiate new ones where development could feature prominently, and to carry out an informative mapping exercise together with other relevant international organizations on barriers along supply chains. In conclusion, the multilateral trading system is facing unprecedented global challenges with great uncertainty and instability. The MC, as the highest decision-making body for the WTO, should be better leveraged to enhance the rulemaking nature of WTO, chart the way forward, and help this organization face up to all the challenges. I will stop here. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. I must say, even before hearing from our Thai counterpart, we're accumulating quite a list of challenges and various dimensions that I empathize with our commentators and discussants in sorting out the consensus and decision-making principle, the substantive issues of investment for development and development more generally, the role of capital-based officials, the SOM, as you put it, borrowing from APEC, the possibility of ad hoc or intercessional ministerials among them. So thank you for enriching our menu for discussion. Let me turn to the Ambassador of Thailand with some experience in this field. So, Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Minister, and also good afternoon to my colleagues. Today is my holiday, so I'm working from home now. I think I'm very sorry I won't have anything readily written like my two previous colleagues, Ambassador James and Ambassador Chenggang, because I only have my note written in my handwriting. But I'm happy to report to you, Ambassador Fry, that some of the suggestions how to improve the ministerial conference, I agree and I share with Australia and China, of course, because we were co-sponsors. So there are elements that overlap or those that have been tabled by them. But I would like to share the experience of my country as the middle grounder and rather smaller developing countries in the last two MCs in particular. And also I would like to share my view as a chairperson of a TRIPS Council who had to operate during the MC as well. So I have a few points in these respects. To me, when we talk about WTO MCs, we may think of it as two possibilities. If we think of WTO as a shipyard, we have to make a ship and launch it every couple of years. The MC could either be an occasion where you come and have champagne built bang on the ship and launch it with something that we have done and going to the unknown future. Or it should be an occasion where, okay, ministers who are, the top CEOs of the shipyard, of the ship company, come and agree on a few last important issues like what color we are going to put on our ship before launching it in. I would say that it might be easier if the WTO MC is just like a champagne celebratory event, but it should not be like that, because otherwise, many ministers may not be interested to come. And therefore, I do believe that there must be certain elements of negotiating function that the MC must provide. But I share with James and Ambassador Lee that it should not be too many, we always say that a lot of things should be done in Geneva, but leave only key issues for ministers to talk about and claim as their work, that's how they achieve the WTO and do conclude it together at MC. But from the last two MCs, I see that especially the MC 13, we could not agree on many things in Geneva and left, in my view, too many issues to be negotiated at the Abu Dhabi. And that's why it came out as it was. So we think about it a lot, but So I have a few issues to share on how we can think about the MC. First, as Ambassador James and Ambassador Lee said, we need to have the process between MC done much better and more frequent. I would call it we should have more dialogues. I think in the papers we have proposed that we say that we should have more engagement at ministerial and at senior official level. For me, I think even more than that. We the middle grounders. I call myself the cafeteria crowd in MC. We were left without any information. There was almost complete lack of transparency. I had to say it. We were not informed. We had to talk to each other. Did you know that who was in the room upstairs on the third floor? Who are negotiating with whom or what? Nobody knew anything. Most of the major countries' minister, they came in and they go straight up to the VIP room and left us scrambling around, having coffee, having sandwiches, and waiting for everybody to come out. I think this is very unacceptable. And it is not only Thailand who are not happy with how it was. I'm not blaming it on anybody. I just think that the process needs to be better. And we can address this a little bit, from happening again at the MC by doing more work and more discussion before we go to MCs. So I'm thinking of things like Friends of the Chairs, or we have a dialogue, and we can also involve discussions, with outside stakeholders as well. We have to do the work beforehand. So we more developing countries and even LDCs would have a sense of ownership, that we have sense of involvement, and that we have we agree that there is more transparent, and hence leading to more trust. If we talk about trust building but no action to build trust, it will not come out of nowhere. So I would say in the meantime, we need to start the process that get more involvement from those who are often left behind. And I think the other thing that I would like to share is that this process, it doesn't have to be formal by a general council chair. It should be something informal, that we can come and talk to GC and other chairs, maybe together in a non-binding information sharing manner, but also we should provide feedback to them. Let's say, like James said, which I agree, that at the MC14, we should try to do two things. One thing is to wrap up what we have been doing, but more importantly, we have to lay down the path for the future. And this is where I see the WTO MC's role should be focusing more. We build a boat, but we have to agree on what is the next boat is going to look like. What is the ship? How is it going to be big? Is it going to be small one but fast, modern, technology related? We have to set out the path that we want to do in the future. And I think that so that is how I see it, that we have to increase the process before MC. At the MC, I also think that we need more transparency. Again, like I said, for me, from Thailand, let's be very frank, I do not expect my minister to be invited to the VIP discussion. So why would I need my ministers to be there for 4 days? They would only do bilateral meetings. What's the value added for multilateral issues if ministers come and they don't know what they are going to do there? So once again, I am not complaining, I'm just being realistic, but that would happen. So there must be a redesign of MC meeting and procedures. We would like to be informed and have evening debriefing by either the team of DG or the General Council or the TNC, somebody who keep all members involved. I think that this is talked about by Ambassador Lee. I agree that at the MC we cannot be left alone and clawing in the dark trying to get information for full 4 days, and at the end of the day everybody come and say we agree on this, please raise your hand that we support. We could not do that. So I think that there's procedures that we can improve, and if we can guarantee the success of the future MC. My last point, Mr. Chair, I want to say a few things as my experience as a TRIPS Council Chair during the MC. At the MC 13, it was good enough and lucky for me enough that I as a chair, help members concluded the issue on TRIPS waiver extension. So it did not appear at the MC 13, but I was left with one key issue that needed decision from the ministers, which was non-violation complaints. Throughout the whole process there, I was not informed much about what was going on in the bigger picture. And I had to consult members on when are you ready to make decision on non-violation moratorium? But then they asked me, when are you expecting this decision to be made? I could not provide them because I don't know what is going on, not only as a members, but not as a chair. I had to tell everybody that please get in touch with me and Secretariat, so we know when we had to make decision. But still at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, what happened is we didn't even know when, even on the last hour when we went into the plenary, and this decision had to be made, but it had to be raised by a member. If it could not be raised by the chairperson because it was the matters that members had to raise. And I was discussing intensively with Secretariat on should we enlist a support from some members who had key interest on non-violation to raise their flag, so then I as a chair can propose that we make decision. But luckily before I had to go around and find somebody to raise their flag, there was one member from the Latin America who had key interest in this. He came to see me and he said, Chair, we're going to make decision on this. And I said, oh, I'm so happy you are here because I need you to raise the flag and ask the plenary meeting to make decision on this. Otherwise, it would not get made. The decision was not going to be made. And this is one flaw that I think we can address in the coming MC, that some issues, there must be better organization on procedures as well as involvement, even from the chairs and Secretariat. So there was other issues that, but I think it may be too controversial for me to raise, so I would just leave it there. But let's say we also need to consider procedures by DG and by the host country, whether they can support, how they can support in preparation for the MC. But I will not go into that simply because there's no time. And I think many issues that James and Ambassador James and Ambassador Lee have suggested, I fully share with them. Yeah. So that's all from me now. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for rounding out the picture with yet more dimensions of the challenge of ministerial conferences, including, importantly, how the days are organized. Is there time for caucusing for middle powers and others to at least be informed among like-minded, be it geographically, levels of development, issue-based, or otherwise? Is there an active ministerial host chair that alongside the Director General plays a role in helping to shape outcomes and to convene and to consult? You highlighted the Secretariat, and we have many eminent and experienced Secretariat, former Secretariat officials here, and how they can help and shape. No one's mentioned the other dimension, which is the broader stakeholder community, or communities. The MCs do attract a range of interest from a range of countries, and after all, the rules being set or advanced are in aid of those acting in the real world. So what should be the relationship between those affected and those discussing at ministerial meetings? So thank you again. We're pretty well on schedule, although, as I said earlier, I truly empathize with our discussants to try and distill in 10 or 12 minutes each, what lessons they've drawn from their own experience and from the insights offered by our ambassadorial speakers. Cecilia, may I turn to you first with your wealth of experience, including at the ministerial inner room VVIP circles in which you've moved. So may I turn it over to you, please?
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's so nice to see you, and thank you for your thoughtful introductions. If everybody was as wise as you, we wouldn't have a problem with the ministerials, I think. And I don't claim to have any solutions here, but I think it's really, really important that we start to discuss this and also getting into the nitty-gritty, how we can advance from the events where, and we've all been there, where ministers are reading from a paper that someone has prepared and there's no real discussion and then nothing happens. Because there are a lot of occasions where ministers or responsible people do meet. You have mentioned APEC and OECD. There's also G20 meetings. I know that every time in Davos, there is a bunch of 30, 35 ministers going there. So no, this is of course random who is there. And it's also a question of resources. Many countries cannot send their ministers there, obviously, but it is a question. It is an opportunity. But very often I have been to these meetings and I've left with a feeling of it's nice to talk. It's nice to hear the different viewpoints, but it's very much reading out from a script that someone has read. And then we all go home and we said, it was a good meeting. So how do we move from that? And that is a very important, that's what we're trying to find a way forward here. And having more ministerials, yes, that could be a way, but then it also comes back to the amount of preparations and of the resource. It's costly for many countries to send their ministers or state secretaries or deputy ministers or what have you to these occasions. And also you need to find that way that the important work that you and your colleagues are all doing in Geneva on a daily basis, that is linked to what ministers are doing and talking in capitals, because so often I have felt and met and heard that frustration that we do the work and then the ministers fly in and they're not really prepared and they're not really in it. So that link needs to be deepened. And I think there are several important suggestions here that maybe there could be more regular meetings or ad hoc meetings or meetings where the ambassadors do most of the work, and then there are a few very targeted issues where ministers can decide they are well prepared, they know why it is meaningful for them to go, because as the Thai ambassador said, of course you have to explain to your minister that it is really important that she or he is there and that she or he will be in the room and can, even if not in every room, but at least feel that the transparency and the ownership is there. That could, of course, be one option. In the European Union, we have something we call the General Affairs Council, which means that ahead of every summit where the prime ministers meet, and this is more and more often now, the EU ministers, they meet 3 days in advance and they prepare the agenda. They do most of the drafting, most of the proposals. So it boils down to the very nitty tricky things that ministers, it's not technical, it's really important where ministers can decide, and also making the big sort of declarations. This maybe could be something we could imagine, a sort of intermediate level of state secretaries or deputy ministers coming a couple of weeks in advance, trying to identify, try to agree on what can be agreed in advance, or at least preliminary, and then leaving for the ministers the real issues so that they come prepared to discuss and to really feel that these are important items that now we need to decide, now we need to move forward. Because everybody talks about reform and everybody, there's so high expectations, as many of you said, for the ministerials. And then we're all happy when there are a few little agreements. They are important, but it's not the successes that we would want to see. And even if you so wisely talk about that we need to take a few steps forward. We cannot do a big bang reform on everything we want to change in the WTO. I think it is linked, and you touched upon this, all three of you, that we need also to look at, can we in any way strengthen the role of the Secretariat when it comes to helping member states and the ambassadors to sort of distill the real essence and distribute that to ministers and then play a more active role there. So these are issues that we need to talk about as well in the coming. But I was very, I felt quite inspired listening and also reading your papers, and I do know how much important work there is done at in the different working groups and at the General Council in Geneva, but there's still a very big gap to the capitals and to risk ministers. So somehow they need to be involved earlier, more systematically, and on the political basis. And I think maybe state secretaries or deputy ministers or something could be a link there to sort of as the Australian ambassador also said, to sort of put down a little bit the intense pressure of you have to deliver something, because then it will be more pre-cooked, so to say. These were a few initial thoughts, but I'm looking very much forward to hear what Peter has to say and the rest of you, because we have quite some time for discussion as well, Jonathan. And thanks for your initial comments.
No, thank you so much. And as I said, we have a richness of wisdom in the over 50 participants who are with us this morning. I'll add one observation, because you too have endorsed what our Chinese colleague argued for, a so-called SOM, or senior officials. And that is, we do have a parallel in the so-called Sherpas process for G7, G20, BRICS, and so on, that has capital-based officials. Those of us long in the tooth will remember the so-called Invisibles group, and then subsequently China and Australia co-chaired on an ad hoc basis two senior officials, deputy ministerial meetings in Geneva, together with ambassadors as well. But the other thing to reflect on, and Peter, you may wish to comment, is the fact that almost alone among the international institutions, the WTO and its members are not in the habit of decision-making. Take the IMF, for example, making momentous decisions each and every year affecting the fundamental finances of a country. And those are decisions that are taken as a matter of course after debate each and every year. And it's not as if they have to wait to bundle and make a round out of it. It happens. It happens at the OECD. It happens at the United Nations. So is there a way, and there was one element in the papers that said maybe meeting annually and getting into the habit of just doing what has to be done and growing out of the single undertaking mentality might itself help. But I put that out just to be provocative. Peter, you're a former Secretariat official, you're a wise observer, together with your scholarly colleague, Bob Wolf, who's on the line. You've given, at best, a mixed report card on MC 13 by way of outcomes. I won't categorize it as cup half full or half empty, but the floor is yours to comment both on substance and procedure, as we've been talking about, and then we will open it to discussion. So Peter, delighted to have you as the
As the sufferer of the Stockholm syndrome, I think, and not just the Stockholm syndrome, but the feeling that I'm really out of my depth here. Years of experience doesn't necessarily give you wisdom. I'm not going to answer your questions, Jonathan, because I don't have any answers. I only have questions. As you said, my thoughts are heavily influenced by working with Bob Wolf, who he's also on here, and maybe, hopefully, he'll add things that I get wrong or where I leave things out. I have put links to the articles that we wrote together in the chat. And one of those is the scorecard. And we do very definitely say we don't think it's half full. Because we didn't just count the issues, we looked at the importance of the issues, and we also looked at which of those issues really needed a ministerial conference and which of those didn't, which is basically what my comments are going to be about, because they're based on one question: what is a ministerial conference for? And the most obvious one is one that you refer to, Jonathan, which is decision making, and that is written into the WTO agreement about what the role of the ministerial conference is and its relationship to the General Council and so on. I would add one point that Bob contributed to one of our articles, which is that tinkering with the process won't actually help when there are fundamental disagreements, because somehow or other you've got to tackle those disagreements. And although I don't know what the actual solution is, it seems to me that there has to be some kind of conversation somewhere between, if for example, there are problems with certain issues being blocked, and I'm not talking about whether there's a philosophical difference over whether certain types of agricultural subsidies should be used or not that depth, but blockages that mystify many of us sometimes. There has to be some way to get around that, and it's probably not going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen in a plenary in a ministerial conference, and it might need to happen completely away from the WTO, and the sort of halfway house between being completely outside Switzerland and completely outside the WTO is that, for example, in the Uruguay round, various groups of members did get together and meet in restaurants and coffee shops and so on, and they had informal names depending on where they were. And then they may have brought that back to the plenaries. But the point is that there is a whole range of different opportunities where maybe some kind of discussion could work, but certainly is probably needed away from the limelight, where positions might soften and things might work. Now, I would say that Abu Dhabi failed, but it was also a fiasco. And there are two different things going on there. Abu Dhabi failed because the gaps were not narrowed nearly enough before the meeting. And you've all said that, so I'm not going to continue with that much more. I seem to have a couple of questions about, yes, it's obvious that senior officials need to be involved more. Yes, maybe intersessional ministerial meetings will help. In the past 2 or 3 years, there have been senior official meetings and there have been intersessional ministerial meetings. Personally, as an outsider, I'm not sure they achieved anything at all. If you take the fisheries subsidies ministerial meeting, that was global, so the people around the Pacific kicked off the day, and then as the sun moved around, then the speakers changed. There was no dialogue as far as I'm aware, even though I wasn't there, but from what people told me. So it was another case of people reading out statements, and it doesn't seem to have had any effect at all on the fishery subsidies negotiations. So it's not just a question of having intersessionals or SOMs, the SOM as well. I'm not sure how much progress was made at the SOM before Abu Dhabi that would get things going. There has to be thought about how those are going to be organized in such a way, for example, in the way that Cecilia talked about, where ministers are actually talking to each other rather than reading out statements. Okay, Abu Dhabi was a fiasco, not just because people disagreed, but because of the way it was organized. And there were tensions that didn't need to be there. I'm not going to go into them. I think most of you know what things that happened. We've written about it. Part of the fiasco was because other things were being organized and other things were happening that prevented the actual decision-making process from operating smoothly. So there were all these glitzy PR events and various other things going on. And from what we've been told by delegates who were there, and it's difficult for us because we were outside, we weren't even in Abu Dhabi, obviously, we were remote. It seemed that there were times when delegates didn't know who was meeting where. It wasn't just the chair of the TRIPS Council who didn't know what was going on. And they were running around and weren't sure which meeting they should be in and so on. So that kind of thing was not organized that well, and it seemed that too much of the emphasis of the energy went into other events were probably less important to what was the core work, or could have been the core work of what that meeting was supposed to be. So that was decision-making and how decision-making was distracted. So what is a ministerial conference for? The other thing is for ministers to get together and talk. And several of you have already mentioned that. So again, I'm not going to repeat it too much. But they need to be real conversations. I'm not convinced, and it sounds from what some of you have been saying today, that the conferences in the conversations in Abu Dhabi were not really conversations. They were statements that were read out. It might have been useful for country X to hear a minister from country Y say something or other, but it's not the kind of conversation that's going to encourage people to get deeply into a subject and produce things, as far as I know. I mean, you had, what was it, 2 hours, 3 hours with over 100 ministers wanting to speak? How many minutes does each of them get to speak? What kind of dialogue can you have when that's set off? And then related to that was, again, that's been mentioned, I think Ambassador Baxter mentioned it, that one of the ideas was to have deliberations start, conversations on things like industrial policy and subsidies, but it was blocked. So not even getting that going after the ministerial conference was blocked. And so whether or not that can be recovered and done more sensibly back in Geneva remains to be seen. That's certainly a challenge. The third purpose of a ministerial conference has only briefly been touched on. And I say this because my experience of ministerial conferences before the WTO was as a journalist, and in the WTO was as part of the information division, where we set up press events and colleagues set up events for NGOs and so on, and facilities. So we were dealing with substance, but we were also dealing with how that substance was being disseminated to the public. And ministerial conferences are occasions when a lot of journalists come, but noticeably fewer and fewer. But still, there are journalists there who are not necessarily following the WTO all the way through. So it's an opportunity for the public to get to understand what's been happening in the WTO. But now that I'm no longer tied to the Secretariat, I can say a little bit more freely that certainly Abu Dhabi appeared to me to miss the purpose, the objective of how you supply information to the public, and that includes stakeholders, of course. Everyone in the public is a stakeholder of one kind or another, whether a consumer or a producer or a trader or whatever. And from time to time, they need to know what's happening in the WTO and to understand it properly. And I think there was far too much PR. We had ceremonies of the ratification of the fisheries subsidies agreement, which was actually a failure. There was a really low number of countries that have ratified the fisheries subsidies agreement. It is still nowhere near being implemented, but there was some kind of ceremony there. Now, I'm willing to accept the idea that if you make something look very, very positive and make it a celebration, then that is the way to encourage it. So it's like you have all carrot but no stick. Sometimes people who are responsible for things like this have to say, look, this is not going well. But if you keep saying, oh, everything's well and the glass is half full, I wonder if that actually helps the process or not. And it certainly does not create credibility for the WTO in the eyes of the public. And I think that credibility and information are also very important outcomes from a ministerial conference, and that needs to be borne in mind as well. And I'll leave it at that.
Peter, thank you so much. I'm going to invite each of the speakers to comment first on what they've heard, but before doing that, there's only one hand raised, and I don't mean to assign any age, but John Weeks has raised his hand. John, for those of you who don't know, is the only person to have chaired both the GATT contracting parties and the WTO General Council through the transition. And that means a wealth of experience from Punta del Este to Montreal to Marrakesh and onward as well. So John, would you add your comments, and then we'll turn back to the speakers. That still gives us a good 15 or 20 minutes for others to offer their insights and comments. So John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I must say, I think this is a wonderful discussion this morning.
Все нормально, работает, Мариш?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but not very loud, Ambassador. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll speak more loudly. I've got quite a loud voice, so I'll see if that helps with the electronics. I must say, I've participated as a Canadian official in every GATT and WTO ministerial meeting between 1982 and 1998. And during that same period, I participated in a lot of informal ministerial meetings as well. And I must say, I think this issue of how to make ministerial meetings productive is perhaps the most important issue before the WTO. It's because it's key to unlocking all of the other issues that are there. I would like to just refer briefly to one experience, which I think is perhaps worth thinking about in terms of how to try to get the combination of engagement of different people to bring about an eventual agreement. And the thing that came to mind as I was listening to the discussion this morning was the midterm review at ministerial level of the Uruguay round in Montreal in 1988. And this meeting, of course, I was the Canadian ambassador to the GATT at that time. This meeting was prepared through, endless green room meetings in Geneva and meetings of the various negotiating groups. And finally, a document was put together that was put before the ministers in Montreal. And the ministers worked very hard, but it fell short. A lot of things were agreed upon, but there were three major issues about the future organization of the work of the negotiations, because this was the midterm review, that the ministers could not reach agreement on at that conference. And so basically, they turned to the Director General, who was the chair of the Trade Negotiations Committee at official level, and asked him to conduct consultations with a view to trying to see if there was a way forward. And Arthur Dunkel then set up a process of consultations in Geneva on a 1+1 basis. So most countries had the senior capital negotiator for the different issues and the local ambassador. And Arthur Dunkel also at the same time initiated a process of consultations in capitals with individual countries at both senior official and ministerial level. The result of this process, which lasted from the end of the ministerial meeting, which I believe was in December of 1998, it continued through into April of 1999, at which point it was enough agreement had been reached that it was actually possible for the Director General, as chair of the Trade Negotiations Committee, to convene a meeting of the Trade Negotiations Committee at which almost all governments were represented by senior officials, not ministers. And this meeting reached agreement that the ministers had failed to reach the previous December. And so the negotiations were able to proceed onwards. Of course, there were some further hiccups as it went along, but I think this is a very interesting example of how, at least on one occasion, an interesting and sort of innovative interaction of using ministers and senior officials actually worked. And I must say, another thing that has stuck with me after sitting through endless ministerial meetings is that ministers are not necessarily well equipped to conduct the detailed negotiations that needs to take place at that point in the process. And I mean, some ministers are very good at it. I think ministers from the commissioners from the EU are often very good at it because, of course, they have a lot of experience, as you were saying, Commissioner Malmström earlier, in preparing for the General Council meeting and so on. You have an opportunity to have a lot of practice, if I could put it that way. So, but I think different countries have different ways in which ministers are selected, and their degree of expertise in the subject matter of some of these arcane trade issues varies greatly. So I think it's a mistake to try to look for ministers to provide the ultimate solutions on these matters. Very briefly, the last thing I'll say, I was chair of the General Council in 1998 when there was a ministerial meeting in Geneva. And on that occasion, I remember I pleaded with delegations to, let's not overreach this time. Let's just have a meeting at which we have discussions. And eventually it was agreed there would be 2 agenda items, one dealing with implementation issues and one dealing with future work. And there were no green room meetings as a result of this. There were no sort of issues that needed to be decided. There was no need for a cafeteria group, Ambassador Pitfield. And I said, you know, this would be very good. This would give an opportunity for all ministers to be able to speak, and importantly, also listen to what their colleagues are saying. And then there were a lot of bilateral meetings on the side. And I think that creates a sort of constructive environment. So I think what has to be worked out is clearly ministers need to be involved politically in the decision-making at the WTO. The question is, how do you do that in a way that makes sense and it's going to produce results? And so I'm going to listen to the rest of this discussion with great interest. And as I say, I think this is perhaps the most important issue that needs to be resolved by WTO members if the institution is really going to work properly. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Reminded of the old saying that he or she who doesn't read history is doomed to repeat it. So a long record, as I said at the outset of our discussions, of quite a range of experience. In light of the time, I think it might be best to open the floor now to comments from others. So please raise your hand. We'll take a few of those observations and then go back to our 3 speakers and 2 panelists to help us digest the observations. Hamid, I see your hand up, so please.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone. A wonderful, wonderful discussion. I have a comment and a question at the end. My comment actually is, John Weeks just reminded me of the history of what we went through during the 80s and what happened at the midterm review. I was also there at the same time, but I always joke about it and say I was 12 at the time. But I can completely remember what has been happening since the 1982 ministerial and what followed. And from all that, I think we can say safely now that the quality of ministerials depend on the quality of preparation. That's the reality. I don't think we can have an absence of the right conversations and the right engagement before ministerials, and then just expect that ministers getting together would resolve things. Now, there is a problem with WTO ministerials. I remember when we came towards the end of the Uruguay round, and we were in the sort of legal drafting group putting together the provisions of the Marrakesh Agreement, and the idea of having a ministerial every 2 years actually raised a lot of concerns among a wide group of us experts at the time, because ministerials in the old GATT were always historical events. So having a historical event every 2 years was not a realistic expectation. Now, the result of that, of course, as we know, is that ministerials have become a near-death experience every time, and they were difficult to manage. But just to focus this thought here, I think a key going forward is the quality of engagement before ministerials, and that involves engagement among ambassadors. Definitely, this is where the real work happens. The role of the Secretariat, I think, needs to be refreshed, to say the least. And then third, there is a critical role for what I would call the honest broker, someone who would not be sitting behind a flag, who would actually give thought leadership to the conversation. I remember during the Doha Ministerial, there was a long conversation about whether the Director General should chair the Trade Negotiations Committee. And we've come full circle to the same place and saying, yes, it is only the Director General who can play the role of the honest broker with the substantive support of the Secretariat in order to be able to unpack complex issues and suggest alternative solutions in a very, very impartial way. Now, I think having the right kind of conversations is definitely a prerequisite. Which brings me actually to the big picture now. We've been talking about WTO reform. This is where my question comes in. WTO reform is absolutely necessary across the three functions. Ministers have said that, because the three functions actually are now dysfunctional to a large extent. Now, the question is, do you, and this is a question to the speakers and discussants as well, do we actually see hope now that we can have a more deep engagement on WTO reform? Looking, for example, at the negotiating function and having a focused conversation about the institutional challenges that are holding back the negotiating function, be it about clarifying the rules on plurilateral negotiations, clarifying what kind of approach should be taken to the application of special and differential treatment across different areas, what kind of more variable geometry we can introduce into the system, what kind of capacity building can we give developing countries and LDCs for negotiations, because all the capacity building that we give LDCs in developing countries are for implementation, but not to help them to negotiate. These kind of really deep institutional challenges that hold back the negotiating function. And we keep asking the WTO to produce outcomes, but we keep asking a machine to produce outcomes while the machine itself is broken. So the question is, do we have really a reasonable opportunity now to engage seriously on fixing that machine? So I would love to hear your take on that. And thank you, Jonathan.
No, thank you, Hamid. Lots more to add to the mix. Professor Wolf, please raise your hand, others now, and then if not, we'll turn to our 5 lead speakers to respond to the rich set of observations from each other and the interveners we've had so far. So Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very interesting discussion so far. I've been learning a lot. I'm looking forward to the recording so I can keep better notes on it all. Let me make an outsider's observation that you don't actually need ministers to make any decision at the WTO. And yet you need ministers to come to the WTO. So the question is, why do you need them and what should they do? And I think you need them for those decisions that have big implications at home, because it's not the ambassador who makes those decisions at home. It's the minister who has to go to cabinet or whatever the decision-making process is. That means the minister has to understand what the issue is, and the minister has to feel part of whatever decision was made in the WTO that the minister is taking back to cabinet. And one of the things we know, people have mentioned it, Bernard Hoekman and I wrote a big paper on it, there's a big gap between Geneva and capitals. And so one of the reasons you bring ministers to anything at WTO is to close that gap, to build their understanding. And so what do you get from a ministerial? Well, probably the most important thing that you get is that the minister has to be briefed before going to the meeting. I saw this when I was part of our summit team. Jonathan, you lived it, right? There's a lot of prime ministers who you can never brief on an international economic issue, but hey, they're going to see the other G7 leaders, they're going to see the other trade ministers, tell me what's going on. So it's a chance to bring them up to speed. And then it's a chance to get them to talk to their peers, because they like listening to each other a lot more than they like speaking to annoying bureaucrats. Those are big things that you get from a ministerial. That leads me to one procedural suggestion, and I think it's entirely consistent with what Peter was saying about why MC13 was a fiasco. Get them talking to each other in small groups right from the start. And that's all ministers. I think the ambassador from Thailand was very clear that it can't just be the VVVIPs who get to go in small groups. Everybody should be. And it's actually important that people get into a small room with the people they don't agree with. Get the principal antagonists together on various issues and have them talk to each other about what the problem is and what needs to be done. But otherwise, as I said, I'm glad I got to listen to this conversation. Lots of very interesting ideas. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. With about 10 minutes left, divided by 5, that means we need rapid fire lightning round insights and observations from our speakers and discussants. Why don't we go in reverse order then? Peter, then Cecilia, and then back to our 3 ambassadors. Peter, any further reflections?
Jonathan, you're going to love me. I don't have anything more to add to what's already been said, which is very, very instructive. Thank you.
We look forward to yours and Bob's next installment of the WTO saga. Cecilia.
Yes, very briefly, because I think the ambassadors should end. Just where do we go from here? I mean, there are some very interesting concrete proposals coming up here. Many of them are, aligned or can be built into a same proposal. How do we take this forward to a bigger group of member states and their ambassadors, but also to send it back home to the capitals and to the governments to see if we can work, and of course involving the Secretariat in this, because the clock is ticking and soon there will be preparations for the next ministerial. So there's a lot of very thoughtful insights here. So it would be a pity if it doesn't get wings outside of this group today. Thank you for inviting me as well.
To borrow the North American baseball phrase, that's a softball back to the ambassadors, with an eye on the at least penciled in July retreat, but also begging the question of how you get from here even to there, let alone MC14, as the case may be. So let's continue on. Pimchanok, can we turn to you first for your further reflections?
Yes, thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much for the discussions, as well as Ambassador Jarvi, who I just met last week. Very, very illuminating. And I have 2 points to add to what I have said, and this is about expectation for MC14. Okay, we know what happened in 12 and 13. Let's try to make the 14 better. For me, the role of the MC14 is I share with Ambassador James from Australia that a majority of attention for preparation for MC14 is for laying down the path of the future. And that is why I think, of course, we have agriculture, fishery to conclude, e-commerce, ASI, but it is very important for WTO to remain relevant, and we have to seriously taking up these emerging issues, which may be answering a question by Hamid. That yes, we are serious about to talk to WTO reform, but we also need to but that includes deliberative issues and new issues that are emerging. I share with you that that is the thing that we have to spend our time with. I hope that MC14 will, before we go there, we should have a clearer agenda in mind, at least a year before. We're going to do development, we're going to do trade, climate change, we're going to do industrial policy, and digital economy, or what, have some focused discussion on those, that this is the new ship that we are going to launch. And we should involve, my second issue, we should involve stakeholders outside. And I'm not getting commission for this, but okay. I read a lot from book by Professor Wolf, particularly I like very much on having information and views, so that from outside and from a think tank or GTA or PIIE to substantiate and help negotiators to be grounded in the real world and what is happening. So in factual based negotiation should be an important issue. So I just have these two issues that we have focused agenda well before MC14, and we should involve artifacts and other players in the trading system so we know where we're going. And thank you very much.
I'll unmute here. Thank you very much. I hope you don't lose sight of your shipyard analogy, because another outstanding issue is shipbuilding and shipbuilding subsidies. So you can add that to your agenda as well. Let us turn to elsewhere in your neighborhood, the Ambassador of China, for your final reflections.
Thank you, Fried, and also thank all the participants. I learned a lot of insightful views on this topic. I've worked in Geneva more than 3 years. Actually, I feel what puzzles me most is that it seems all members know where the problems are, and also they all call for the reform and change. But the fact is, the result is not so obvious. So that's a problem. Actually, we repeatedly discuss all the same or similar issues, but no substantial change. So how to transform the idea, how to transform the new mindset into actions? I think that's a key issue we have to further think about. Of course, as a barrister in Geneva, we have our duty. Thank you.
Jonathan, you are muted. Jonathan, you are muted.
Yeah. Oh, look who's here. Welcome back from a distance. I was just saying the ambassador and Cecilia both have put the tremendous burden on Ambassador Baxter to turn these reflections and words and input from public policy institutes and other stakeholders and past participants into action. So Ambassador Baxter, you're going to solve everything in the remaining 5 minutes with a clear roadmap for senior officials, ambassadors, and ministers. Over to you with that easy task.
Reminds me of what you expected of us when you were General Counsel Chair, Jonathan. So I can't possibly aspire to that. Thank you to everyone for the discussion. There really have been a lot of terrific ideas out there. I do think, as a couple of people have said, the challenge is for us to grapple with what we do with some of these. For me, I suppose the important observation is there are two categories of work that perhaps we in the WTO can do. One is externally facing, and that relates to expectations management and setting. And really that's having a better discussion than we've been able to have, perhaps individually, but certainly collectively, about what is going to be useful for our ministers when they come to Yaoundé at the end of next year or the beginning of the following year. What are they going to want to be making decisions about, or to be setting directions on? What is going to be relevant for them and their governments at the time? I think that's something we can get onto, but that's very much an iterative process. The other one is the internal one, and that's on the delivery side. And that is, when we know what our expectations are, how can we work with the Secretariat to make sure the conferences run as well as it can be? And as a number have said, a lot of that will relate to what we do between now and departing for Cameroon. And that's something where I think we have started some ideas. We've heard some further ones here today. And so I think we've got some steps we can look at, but a lot more effort will be needed. So if we can achieve on both the expectations management side and on the delivery side, we'll be setting ourselves up for a more successful MC14. And that's what we'll certainly be aiming to do. Thank you.
Again, thank you. Let me thank, on behalf of all those listening in, thank all of the speakers and discussants. What I take from this, as I've sort of said throughout, is there's a very rich list of dimensions that merit further reflection and attention. That does point to discussions that are not rulemaking or negotiating, but rather deliberative, as they're calling it these days in the General Council, whether among capitals or in Geneva or both. Cecilia alluded to this, but taking advantage of regional and plurilateral settings when senior officials or ministers are getting together in any event, APEC, G20 trade ministers, and so on, as an opportunity to caucus along the way. And John Weeks, recalling 1998, does remind us that it is possible and plausible to have ministerial interest and attention and engagement in a non-negotiating, non-rulemaking shaped agenda. We didn't really come back to the key role of the Secretariat, the Council Secretary and the department heads. Hamid referred to that. We didn't come back too much, other than an allusion to Abu Dhabi, to the role of the host chair minister working alongside and sometimes over the top of the DG. I can recall Nairobi, where Amina Mohammed played a very key role, for example. But these suggest, and I leave it to Lou to reflect on whether FMG wishes to have a follow-up discussion, whether we should await further public policy reflections from our members and others, or whether this serves at least as a stimulus to all of us on the call to engage with those currently responsible to give continued attention to what universally in this discussion everyone has identified as of fundamental importance. So right on schedule, I will stop there. Professor Liu, would you like to add a closing word and an anticipation of FMG's forward schedule?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. My apologies to all of you for being late. I was just flying from Shanghai to Beijing, so got stuck in the traffic. But I managed to listen very carefully to the discussion part after the panel, so I already enjoyed a lot. I definitely I will go back to review the video and try to learn from it. As you say that there are many things to discuss, such as the organizational part, the secretariat's point of view. Next month we're going to have a FMG session exactly on that with Stewart, like you, also a former General Council chair, and also Evan and Victor, the two probably the best directors of the sector with decades of experiences of organizing MCs. So that's coming. And speaking about hosting ministers working along with the DG and so on and so forth, immediately you mentioned the name that was on my mind, that Amina. I think she's retired now, so she's free to speak. Definitely we could engage her one day, probably to talk about her experience of Nairobi, so on and so forth. So there are a lot to do, but we will reflect within the board and come back and sending out invitations on some of these issues. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for convening. I hope on the recording, people can also link to the chat, because Peter has put up some links that people, if they haven't, may want to quickly jot down for some of the scholarship that's already available. So again, let me offer very sincere thanks for the robust, insightful, detailed, and reflective discussion that serves as a challenge and an inspiration to tackle these issues further. So all the best to everyone, and we'll reconvene following Lou's instructions when they arrive as to the next FMG session. All right. Thank you all. Have a great day and evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.